So welcome everyone. Over the past 2 years, the Social Issues Action Team has been researching and working on the issues of affordable housing and homelessness in Manatee County. The United Way is one of the trusted resources we have relied on in this process. And in their 2020 ALICE report, we learned that in the Suncoast region of DeSoto, Hillsborough, Manatee, Pinellas, and Sarasota counties, over 550,000 households were struggling to just get by, worried on a daily basis how they would cover basic expenses like rent, food, and utilities, let alone have an emergency like a hot water heater go out or a car breakdown. But we wondered what has happened since 2020. What has been the impact of COVID-19? I'm very grateful today to welcome United Way Suncoast Douglas Griesenauer, Senior Director of Workforce Development and Financial Stability, and Nicole Pena, Senior Manager of Financial Stability Initiatives. Today, Doug and Nicole will help us understand better what the term ALICE, or Asset Limited Income Constrained Employed, means, what's changed since the 2020 ALICE report was published, take us through the United Way Suncoast Eviction Mitigation and Housing Crisis Dashboard, and share the housing policies they are advocating for our counties to implement in order to address the housing crisis in our communities. Doug and Nicole, welcome, and I will watch the chat and let you know when you're ready for questions. Just let me know, and thank you again for being here today.
We're happy to be here. And so I'm going to share my screen and go through a PowerPoint. But before I do, I want to just get a feel for how many people are familiar with the concept of the ALICE report. So if you're on screen, let me see your hands, or if you're off screen, there's a little reactions button at the bottom that you can hit. All right, so a couple people who are aware of ALICE, excellent. Some people who aren't, which is perfect. This is the exact group to talk to. And so I will let you all know. We'll start with a brief intro of what ALICE is. And then again, to Helen's point, we'll dive deep into what does this mean because of the pandemic, and take a spotlight specifically on housing and what are the impacts that we see on housing with this work. And so I will just share my screen for just a second here, and we'll walk through everyone's favorite mode of communication, the PowerPoint. So I will get started. You should be able to see a screen, if that is correct. That looks right. And so I will get started here talking about the work that we're doing with ALICE. And so again, what is ALICE? As Helen mentioned, it is an acronym that stands for the Asset Limited Income Constrained Employed Population. It's individuals who are making ends meet, but not enough to get by. And when we say that that is a tool that exists, a lot of people say, well, we already have something like that. It's called the federal poverty line. Why don't we just use that? And so I want to start with a little history about that federal poverty line, which is created by a very, very intelligent researcher here on the screen named Dr. Molly Orshansky, who was tasked in the 1960s with figuring out how many people in America were not getting by, not making enough money to get by. And being the good researcher that she was, she took the most recent available data to her, which at that time was 1955 Department of Agriculture data on the cost of a basket of goods in America. And at that time, people spent about a third of their income on that basket of goods. And there was a high, medium, and low price point for those baskets. So again, when I'm talking about goods, I'm talking about food, basic necessities, simple costs that individuals had to spend to get by. Since people spent about a third of their income on that basket, she took that basket of goods on the low end, multiplied it by 3, called it the federal poverty line. And that is the federal poverty line we use today in 2022. Adjusted for inflation, of course, but 1955 is a different year than 2022, right? The cost of that basket of goods is very different, and the things that make up that basket are also different, right? Technologies that are necessities some days in order to find work and transportation is vastly unheard of in some cases back in the 50s. And so when we are talking about this work, we need a new basket. Actually, what's interesting is that people spend less, before people spent a third of their income on those goods. Now people spend closer to 1/8 to 1/16 of their income on that goods. So that needs to change. On the same way, a family of 4 for the federal poverty line, whether it be a single mom with 3 kids, is the family of 4 if it's 2 working age adults and 2 high school children. Federal poverty line considers those 4s to be equal, which is dumb, right? Obviously, it costs different amounts in order to get by in different family household types. And the same is true. We were just talking a little bit about our hometowns before this meeting had started. You know, we mentioned New Jersey, we mentioned Ohio, we mentioned Florida. The federal poverty line in New Jersey, Ohio, and Florida is the exact same. When it costs different amounts, not just to live between New Jersey and Florida, but between different parts of Florida, it costs different amounts. And so that is why this tool ultimately undercounts the number of individuals who are truly struggling in our community. And so that comes with the ALICE report. And so all of this comes from unitedforalice.org. And actually, I will, since there are two presenters, I'll ask Nicole real quick to put unitedforalice.org in the chat for everyone to look at. Please use this information as much as you can and as much as you want. This isn't proprietary, steal and steal alike. Share this information with individuals that can benefit from this, because we want to share about how many people really are struggling. And if you look at this chart, about 13% of Floridians are in poverty. So that broken tool, that's, you know, obviously vastly undercounting people. There's still 13% of Floridians that are under that. But then on top of that, we have an additional 33% of individuals that are above the federal poverty line, but not making ends meet. So there's really just a little bit more than half of every Florida household is struggling in some way, shape, or form. And now what does that struggling mean? Everyone tells me don't use a giant sheet with a bunch of numbers in it. It's a horrible way to do a presentation. And then I perpetually ignore them because I really like this chart. And so if you don't like this chart, don't worry, there's a better one 2 slides down. But if you do like this chart, I want to walk through these household groups. Because again, I mentioned federal poverty line doesn't take into account geography and family type. ALICE does. And so on the top, you'll see training. From left to right, there are 6 different household types. We know there are way more than 6. But if you just look to the 4th one, 2 adults and 2 in childcare. I like to pick this one because I have 2 children in childcare. I have a 2-year-old and a 5-year-old. I have pictures. They are adorable. But these kids are the budget that I use for my own life. And I'll tell you, if you train your eyes down to any of these categories, you will see extremely conservative estimates of what it costs to get by in each of these areas. If anyone has children or grandchildren and you're paying for it and you're paying $1,200 for childcare for a month, good for you, because I'm not. And at the same time, if you're getting housing, so typically a family of 4 needs at least a 2-bedroom apartment. And if you're getting a 2-bedroom apartment in our county for $1,066, good for you again. And so these are extremely conservative estimates, but even with all of those, we see that it costs an annual wage of $74,000 at the bottom to get by. Now, the astute reader will notice at the very top, we said we're at the ALICE household survival budget for selected counties in Florida. Our selected counties are Hillsborough, Pinellas, Sarasota, Manatee, and DeSoto, our 5-county area. But you see that this data is from 2018, before the pandemic. These data are slowed down because there were some issues with collecting on the census in 2020. We hope to update it soon, but this data is 4 years old. And with the pandemic, 4 years could be 40 years. And so we actually also like to look at, this is a similar, but not the same, apples to oranges comparison, looking at MIT's living wage calculator. And if you look at MIT's living wage calculator, and again, you look at 2 adults, both working, so that's second column on the right. So in the green is 2 adults, and then look at 2 children. So the category we were just looking at. But now you just look at Sarasota County, Florida, and you go to the bottom, the bare minimum cost to get by in Sarasota County is $101,000. And typically when you look at this and someone scoffs and says, if you're making 100 grand, you're doing great. Really just look at any one of these categories and try to figure out if you can make ends meet on these lines, right? Rent in Sarasota County peaked at, I believe, $2,100 for a 2-bedroom apartment a few months ago. That's more than the $16,000 for a year that's listed here. So these are conservative estimates that still tell you it costs more than 100 grand to get by. And now we know not everyone in Sarasota is making 100 grand, right? So what happens when you're below this amount? You make sacrifices. These are individuals who are trying to make ends meet, who are cutting food, who are getting social services, who are homeless, who are couch surfing, who don't have home insurance, who don't have car insurance, who don't have a car, who are foregoing medications in order to make their budget balance. People are smart and they're hardworking. And so if they can't make this bare minimum, they find a way to get by. But it's through struggle and it is through stress that happens. I will also point out that if you look on the left, you see these categories: food, childcare, medical costs, housing, transportation. Nowhere here does it say debt This, in fact, assumes a budget for a debt-free household, which is kind of rare these days, further proving how conservative these estimates are, and yet they're still very high. So if you hated those last two slides, don't worry, because now comes the prettier part. So WIRS is just a chart. So if you were looking at the federal poverty line, those are the areas in gray, and you look at that household survival budget of 2 adults and 2 in childcare, in the old version from 2018, the federal poverty line doesn't even cover housing or childcare in terms of the costs for people to get by. It is expensive to be poor in our country, and the costs to get by are extensive. That being said, a pandemic happened. And so all of this has to be seen through the lens of the pandemic. But those pandemics, the issues that came from it, only exacerbated what we were suffering from before. Systemic inequity continues to have not been solved. And so we know that single parent households, those under 25 and Hispanic and Black households, they struggled before the pandemic, they're struggling more now. And all of this has to be looked through the lens of COVID-19. And so I want to just look through a couple charts and graphs here. Really quick, when people talk about the pandemic, people talk about it in the past tense a lot. And I want to let you know that the pandemic for a lot of our families, especially those who are struggling, is a present tense issue. And so, for example, a lot of people like to look at unemployment as that example, right? You notice when there's that peak, all the news stories had the Great Depression era unemployment. You guys heard the news, right? In April 2020, we hadn't hit a 14% unemployment rate since the Great Depression. And people have been using unemployment stats to track the severity of COVID. And don't get me wrong, it was bad. But by using this stat, they now say, well, actually, by July of 2022, we've gotten back to pre-pandemic levels. And so if you use this as your marker, everything's great. If you've been judging my tone, you know I'm obviously creating a straw man here because everything is not great. And so right now, this is the St. Louis Fed data. And just real quick, on this chart, this is overall unemployment rates. So this is for the entire US population. And now I break it down by race and sex. So we're looking at Black or African-American men and women and white men and white women. There are lots of different ways to look about it. I just want to use this to show an example when we talk about the systemic inequities that come from the pandemic. And right now, this is a large chart from the year 2000 to the year 2022, the past 2 decades. And what we're going to do is we're going to slowly keep zooming in until we get to the pandemic. But I want to start here most importantly, because people mentioned how that unemployment was Great Depression level unemployment. And they were right for white men and for the general population. But in fact, if you break this down by demographics, in fact, Black or African-American men hit these unemployment rates with the Great Recession. And so we see that actually when we're talking about systemic inequities, this unfortunately is not as 1 in a million situation as it happened. There have been struggles that have broke through. And then if you pull through, what you see is that the recovery from those populations has been extremely slow. And so, like I said, I'm zooming in a little bit, but what I want to show you here is the white line at the bottom on the right of unemployment for white men during the pandemic. And then you train your eyes all the way to the left of the other very similarly colored line, but this one being for Black or African-American men. And you notice that the unemployment rates are about the same from the peak of COVID to January of 2014. January 2014 was 6 years after the Great Recession. 6 years after the Great Recession and 6 years of recovery from that, where most people said the Great Recession was done, there were still large pockets of our populations who were struggling. And the only reason I say that is if we look now to the pandemic and the results from it, we're seeing history play out again. We're seeing the discrepancies between certain populations that have been widened because of the issues of the pandemic. And a lot of the recovery efforts that have taken place have been disproportionately impacting some populations more than others. We know this, for example, through the Paycheck Protection Program, which was a fantastic piece of legislation to help address COVID-19. But when in its implementation, we saw mostly big businesses and mostly, when they broke down the demographics, minority-owned businesses were disproportionately less likely to take advantage and benefit the most from these services and practices. So we're seeing recovery efforts happen in a disproportionate way. And all of this is related to the work of Alice because we know that there are populations who are struggling and the benefits that are provided in a ubiquitous way are not serving our entire population equally. And so we need to have that awareness and that understanding as we're moving forward. Looking statewide, we do know that rural communities are more likely to struggle, but I also want to pull out a zip code map. And by the way, we're going to be sending these slides out to everyone, so I'm going to roll through some of these pretty quickly. The reason I'm rolling through it quickly is just so you can have these data points when I send out the presentation, just so you know. And so if you're like, wait, you're going too fast, I'm doing it on purpose. This is really just more an understanding of this. But what I want to do here is that we're looking in the area. This is United Way's 5-county area. You can look in Sarasota and Manatee, and to no surprise, areas of struggle in the area of Alice mirror the area rates of poverty, right? We know the Newtown area is struggling. We ourselves have, reading rooms and supports in the La Mirada neighborhood in Manatee County. We know that is an area of high poverty, but also high Alice rates. And so we see that there are these pockets in every single zip code of individuals who are struggling. I want to break this down just by a couple areas real quick. And again, I'm going to move through these fairly quickly, but I want to make sure you all have this information. I want to break down Alice by family household types. And this is interesting because typically families with children are most likely to be in poverty. That is true. Kids are expensive. I can speak from experience. But I also want to share that our senior population and our single population are also struggling in Alice, where they may not be struggling as much in poverty. And so this is showing that really when we're talking about individuals who are struggling to get by, while there could be a disproportionate impact on families with children, and that is true, really many household types are struggling to make ends meet. And it doesn't really matter whether or not you have kids or not, or what your age is, there is a level of struggle that's there. But if you do look at those families with children, we do see a vast difference here between those who are single parent households and those who aren't. Some of this is fairly obvious. If you have 2 earners in your household, you obviously can make double the amount of money, or one of the individuals can take off, and now you don't have to pay for childcare. I will preface this that this is census data that breaks it down by married, single female, single male headed households. There are as many household types as there are households in our communities, but just for the sake of argument, we're looking at these 3 from the census. And it shows that obviously if you have dual earners, you are more likely to be stable. If you are a single parent, you are much more likely to struggle, especially for single female-headed households. But the thing I want to also look at is the fact that on the right, so these left 3 graphs are talking about the percentage that are above Alice, Alice, or below Alice. The black and white one on the right, though, shows of all of the families with children, how many are married and how many are single-parent households. And in our 5-county area, 37% of all families with children are single parent households. This is important to note because a single parent family is not an outlier in our community. It is a large swath of the families with children. And so our solution can't just be, look at this graph of, oh, well, just have 2 earners and then we can solve the problem, right? There is a vast number of single parent households that are out there. And so we need to be aware of that single earner household when we're talking about those who are struggling. We'll see that in our housing work as well. And I just put a chart here. Again, the last one was across all of our areas. This is just Manatee County, Florida. I'm going to bounce back and forth real quick just to show you that the charts and graphs are about the same, other than the fact that, in fact, Manatee County, Florida has a slightly fewer people who are above Alice that are single female-headed households. And now you look at households by age. I assure you this is the second to last of our graphs. So if you're getting graph fatigue, hang in with me. And the last thing I want to show here is just the fact that typically when we talk about families in poverty, when the head of the household gets older, they tend to be less likely to be in poverty. They move more forward in their career. They have fewer younger children. They have more supports. And the 65 and older population is the least likely to be in poverty because we have a social safety net in our communities for 65 and older individuals. We have Social Security. We have medical insurance for these individuals. But Social Security and medical insurance does not cover everything to make ends meet. And so, in fact, while that's some of the lowest areas of individuals who are in poverty, they're in fact the highest group outside of those above 25 that are struggling with Alice. And so, again, we know that there's a lot of our seniors in our population, and we see this time and time again of seniors whose rents have increased. And again, I don't want to steal Nicole's thunder, so I'll go quickly here, but rents who have increased and they can't be able to afford it. And so, again, this is a population that we're interested in. I just bring this back and forth to show you that the population here in Sarasota County, as an example, obviously has a much higher senior population than the average. Those who are aware of Sarasota County is aware of that, but the Alice population there still is prevalent. The seniors that are in Sarasota County, there are plenty that are perfectly fine, that are making ends meet, but there are also a lot that are struggling. And then lastly, looking at it, breaking it down by race and ethnicity, to no surprise, we notice that individuals and households that are more likely to be in poverty are also more likely to be in ALICE, right? We continue to have systemic inequities in our communities that make it harder, broken down by race, for families to get by. So that was my 20 minutes to talk to you about the overview of ALICE. And I do know I went quickly, but I want to have time for your questions at the end where we can go more slowly on pieces that you're interested in. But I wanted to spend some time to give the rest of our presentation over to Nicole Pena, who can dive really deep talking about a very important issue that you all care about, which is housing.
Thanks, Doug. So we're going to talk about housing. I have some more graphs and charts, which is exciting if you like graphs and charts. If you don't like graphs and charts, we've got some text too, and we've got an opportunity for me to talk. So in case you didn't know, there's a housing crisis. If you have tried to look at housing, you may have noticed this. I, for one, purchased a house with my family in 2019. And each month we get the little updates from realtor.com and Zillow, and it says, this is how much your house is worth. I'm like, really? That's not what we paid for, but okay. So I personally have benefited from these changes in the housing market as a homeowner. But for many of our households, many renters have been priced out of purchasing homes, and many renters are being priced out of their rental units. And so I want to remind you of two key numbers that Doug showed us when we talked about ALICE, and that was the ALICE household budget of $1,066 for rent each month, and the MIT wage calculator, which put rent at $1,379, so just under $1,400 a month. Keep those two numbers in mind as we look through these charts, because you're going to see something very, very different in our community. So Doug, can you go to the next slide? We wanted to first start and talk about the monthly change of rent everywhere. So across the US, a third of renters had a rent increase of $100 or more in the last year. However, you'll notice that that big blue bubble on the right of that pie chart is people who had no change in their rent. So across the US, a little over half had some change, but for many people, it stayed the same, or if it did increase, it increased by less than $100 a month. If we can go to the next slide. For Florida, though, we see a very different pie chart. So a little over 1/3 of people had a rent increase of over $250. Okay, $250 a month is $3,000 a year. $250 buys groceries for a couple of weeks for a family. It may be somebody's gas budget for the month. $250 is a lot of money for a family that's living paycheck to paycheck. And so that jump for many families has been the hardest. In addition, we see that another quarter of the population in Florida had a rent increase of somewhere between $100 and $249 a month. That too is a big jump that is not just a one-time extra expense, but every single month you've got to figure out where you're going to come up with an extra $100 in a budget. So it's not making the choice to cut back this week. It's figuring out how to cut back every single month to get to live. So we'll go to the next slide. So if any of you have followed our local news, depending on what your choice of newspaper is, you may have seen stories about rent and how rent has changed over the last 2 years. a few months ago, there was a specific graph that showed just the last 6 months and showed that rents were trending downward. And people were like, yay. Much like people said, yay, the pandemic's over. People said, yay, the housing crisis is over because rents were trending down. So here we see in Sarasota and Manatee counties where rents have gone over the last 2.5 years. And I want to call out a couple of key points. So that first orange colored line that is going up and down is when the local eviction moratoriums ended. And we see to that point, rents were fairly stable. There's a little wobble in that line, but they were fairly stable. And after that, we see those rents start to trend upward. That second orange line is when the CDC moratorium ended on evictions. And we see it continue to climb. Now, in August of 2020, we see rent, the average rent for a 2-bedroom apartment in Manatee County was $1,156. That was still higher than what the Alice budget allots for housing. So like Doug mentioned, if you found housing for less than $1,100 in August of 2020, good on you, because that was not the average. So half of people were paying much more than that. And likewise in Sarasota, we're looking at $1,250 a month for rent. But as we look from June of 2020 through June of 2022, we see a huge spike in rent. And we see that that number has not come down to anywhere near where we were before. So while rents have trended down since they peaked in February of 2022, they're still significantly higher than what families were paying before. So in Manatee County, they're paying $1,700 a month. And in Sarasota County, they're paying almost $1,900 a month for the average 2-bedroom apartment. Again, that's significantly higher than both the Alice and the MIT living wage calculator allot for housing. So now we're not just talking about what we saw across the nation or in the state of Florida of rents increasing between $100 and $500. We're talking about families who are paying $600 more per month than what they were paying 2 years ago. Next slide. So I want to take a moment to talk about what it means to be rent cost burdened. This is a phrase that is thrown around. Likewise, you will hear things like affordable housing. So what does it mean to have affordable housing? And so when we talk about affordable housing and rent cost burden, we're talking about how much of a family's income is put toward housing. And the standard is that housing should account for no more than 30% of a household's budget. And households that spend more than that are considered rent cost burden. Some households, as we'll see in a minute, spend more than 50% on their budget. And those families are considered severely rent cost burdened. Across our Suncoast region, half of our families are housing cost burdened. And I want to pause before we go to the next slides. When we talk about rent cost burden, and when we put together these slides, we've only looked at the cost of rent. We also want to remember that when you live in a house, your rent may include utilities. It may not. It may only include water and trash. And so you've still got to pay for electricity. It's not cold enough in my house for me to turn on the heat yet, but what are families doing in the winter to heat their homes? How are they staying cool during the summer? And so In addition, when we are looking at the cost of rent, we also need to keep in mind that families also have to pay for utilities for those houses in most cases. So we're going to focus just on the cost of rent here, but keep that in the back of your mind as well. Next slide. So we talked about different family types, and Doug talked about families who live at the federal poverty level. And this could be a number of families. This can be single parent households. This could be 2-parent households. This also includes our senior community. And so for a family of 4, the federal poverty line is $27,000 or $27,750. And if we track those 2 lines, this is showing how much a family would spend on housing for the average cost of housing in our community. And so if you live at the federal poverty line and you don't have any additional supports, without any additional supplements, you would spend 95% of your income on housing. In Manatee County, it's a little bit better, but you're still spending 90% of your income on housing. That doesn't leave you anything else for utilities, for gas, for food. And so families are having to figure out where they're going to live and what they're going to do to get by. Next slide. We also want to show what happens for families living at minimum wage. And we do recognize that minimum wage did go up in 2022, and we are working to update our data on that. But right now we have this calculated at 2 earners, each earning $10 an hour. Bear in mind that a little over a third of families are single parent households. So that means that instead of 2 earners making $10 an hour, you need 1 earner making $20 an hour to make this work. So families living at who make minimum wage are all severely cost burdened. That means that they are spending 50% or more of their income each month to just cover rent, let alone everything else that they have in their budget. And technically in Manatee County, they are not severely cost burdened, but that's 49%. So if you're like me, I like to round up. It's close enough to being severely cost burdened, and they're feeling severely cost burdened, whether or not we want to quibble about 1%. Next slide. So we know that Florida has planned to expand the minimum wage to $15 an hour by 2026. And proponents of expanding the minimum wage have said this will address issues that families are facing because it will give them more income. And while that is true, it does not solve the entire problem. Because of the significant increases in housing costs, it doesn't address it. So if we look on the left side of this slide, back in August of 2020, we see that 2 earners making $15 an hour would have been okay. They would not have been rent cost burden. But now, because we have increased the cost of rent in our region, even 2 earners making $15 an hour would all be rent cost burdened in our community. So they're still spending more than 30% of their income on their rent and having to figure out where they are going to make that up to pay for their other expenses. Next slide. Then finally, we want to show at the top of the ALICE threshold. So this is a family earning $76,000 in our counties. Even then, they are bordering on being cost burdened by housing because of those increases. So families that are making $76,000 a year, for most of us, that sounds like, okay, that's a decent wage. Like we think about Alice families as people who are getting by. But even then, with the cost of housing, they're still struggling and spending at the very top of what they should be spending on rent alone, let alone the other components of housing, like the utilities, like their water bill, their electric bill, in order to get by. Next slide. So what happens when you can't get by? As a result, people look to other areas for support. And we've seen this happen with 211 calls. Embedded in our database, we have our 211 calls by county or by our entire region. And you can see, and this is updated in real time, how many people are calling into 211 and what they're calling for. And that big blue bubble in both counties, it's the number of people who are calling for supports related to housing. I can't cover my rent. I'm behind on my rent. I'm getting evicted. Where is a shelter? I have been evicted and I need a place to stay tonight. That's what a majority of calls are for. After that, you'll notice at the top that purple color bubble is utilities. So even if people are able to secure a place to stay, they need to be able to live, and they need to have electricity and running water. And so right after housing and shelter, people are calling for utilities. And those two bubbles make up for more than everything else that people call for 211 combined. Next slide. It's getting there. So I want to thank Helen because she reached out to us a few months ago and said, we've been looking at affordable housing and we've been looking at the Schimberg data, and we wanted to find a way to bring that into our housing dashboard and show where houses are. If you drive anywhere in Manatee or Sarasota counties, you will see construction. It is the way of life right now. But we might ask, okay, who are we constructing housing for? Are we constructing housing for individuals who already have housing available, or are we constructing housing for individuals who need housing? Additionally, we celebrated with you all that the American Rescue Plan Act funds went to housing. And that's great. But if there are 1,000 units built and we have greater need, then we've only solved a portion of the problem. So this chart tracks, and it gets updated monthly, the number of affordable housing units by income level. So how many affordable housing units are available for individuals that have the lowest incomes? How many are available for individuals at the middle incomes? And how many at the highest incomes? What's important about this is that we see severe deficits. So for those charts that are going, or those columns that are going downward, that's a deficit. That is, we have more people living at 0 to 30% AMI than we have housing units available. We have more people living at 0 to 50% AMI than we have housing units available. And we have people where we have housing units that are above 120% of the AMI that are available, but we don't have people who have those incomes to afford those units. So when we look at housing, it's not just an either or. It's not simply people with the lowest incomes and people with the highest incomes. We also want to look at those individuals with those middle incomes. We want to look at our Alice families, because those are the people like teachers, like hospital employees, like EMTs and paramedics. Those are individuals that for the last 2 years we have championed as heroes. And we have said that they have put their lives on the line in various ways to keep our community safe and to continue to educate our children. And yet there is nowhere for them to live in our communities. Next slide. And then finally, I want to wrap up my charts and graphs with a chart about affordable housing and fair market rent. And this is, I think, the most complex chart to understand. And so I want you to just take away a basic of it. The fair market rent in Manatee and Sarasota counties is $1,553. The average rent in both of those counties is significantly higher. If you're familiar at all with HUD vouchers, they are designed to help low-income families afford their rent and help them get a place to stay that is safe and sanitary. But those vouchers only go up to $1,500. So that means that an individual has to find a place to stay within that budget. If you recall, last year, Sarasota opened up their wait list to get a housing voucher. The average wait time for an individual in Sarasota County to get a housing voucher is about 3 years. Individuals may wait somewhere between 1 and 7 years to get a housing voucher. And then when they get that housing voucher, they have 60 days to find a landlord who will accept that housing voucher and a unit that is within the price range of that housing voucher. I said to a friend the other day that trying to get and use a housing voucher in Manatee or Sarasota County is harder than getting Taylor Swift tickets. So all of the people who were waiting in the queue for Taylor Swift tickets the other day are the same people who are experiencing the same thing that individuals waiting to get a housing voucher are. And so we'll go to the next slide and we'll talk about how we respond. Things have been bad, and we have ways to help make things at least a little bit better. So we want to share what we've done over the last 1.5 years now. As the eviction crisis started setting in, we began to gather data. We looked at what was happening in our community, who was being displaced, and we brought together community partners. And we said, what can we do about this? And from that, we knew that emergency rental assistance was available. And so we worked in each of our counties to help expedite the process, to help individuals who needed emergency rental assistance to get access to it, and to help them work through the paperwork process of that. And through that effort, we were able to help over 2,000 individuals with housing services. And we kept nearly all of them with an 89% success rate. Almost all of them were able to either stay in their home or achieve new stable housing. And through that, we were able to leverage the money that we put in to provide supports to gather over $1 million in direct assistance to families through emergency rental assistance, through other private and public dollars, and then through direct assistance dollars we integrated. In addition to helping families, we'll go to the next slide, we also focused on advocacy. We know that helping families get access to funding is only one component that we could do. And so we built a dashboard and we worked with local partners to advocate for policies that would help our community. One of the most significant pushes was in Sarasota County, and we can see the leaderboard for the state of how counties have and cities have invested their money. In Sarasota County, a coalition came together and advocated to increase the amount of ARPA dollars going to housing. And now nearly 30% of ARPA dollars are going to building affordable housing. That went from $5 million to over $35 million going into housing. That will add new units and help reduce that deficit. In addition, we began bringing together apartment associations, administrators, and other community partners. And we said, what can we do? That group of people came up with a list of about 40 solutions. And we said, great, do all of them. One solution is not going to fix it. Building units will not solve all of the problems. And so with that, I'm going to turn things back over to Doug, who's going to talk a little bit more about some policies that can be supported and how you can get involved in that.
Yes, and we have about 12 minutes left. And so real quick, I just want to let you know that, how we respond is understanding this is heavy information. We've just sent a lot of things to you. And as people have mentioned in the chat, this stuff is recorded. Please review it, reread it, understand and familiarize yourself with this work. But don't let it give you despair. That's the hardest part of this, is that you can look at this and realize that things are hard for a lot of people. But there are solutions, as Nicole mentioned, right? There are ways that we can continue to support people hit hardest by the pandemic while reinforcing the work that's already going on. I had an individual with a conversation with someone over at a food bank who mentioned that housing insecurity is directly connected to food insecurity, is directly connected to our workforce support problems. And working on any one of those helps build up our community in all of those, because a dollar is a dollar is a dollar. And so ways that we can build up and support is focusing our efforts in really all of those places to build up a collaborative nature of our work. We also need to be educating and advocating about the real magnitude of these things in need. It is good whenever one housing complex comes up, but as Nicole mentioned, you need more. And so this part, you all listening to this, being that advocate, being that prophet in some of these messages are what's important in sharing this. But also, we always need to continue to advocate practices to get by. Nicole mentioned that we paired up individuals with Bay Area Apartment Association, one of the large associations in our 5-county area. And they're actually partnering now with nonprofits to establish what's called master leases. And these are leases that can be had with nonprofits so that nonprofits are able to manage select blocks of housing. And that helps control support services for individuals that are there and ultimately increase the stability in those families that are housed. And so that's just one of many, many, many examples of what's taking place as we move out. But it really does take a village as we build up and build out these supports. Understanding that together we are greater than anything that does come through, but it has to happen together. And it has to happen through that coalition and that community support, which is why I'm so excited to be talking to you all about this, right? You all are a group of passionate individuals that span our community in what's going on. And so we just threw a lot of information at you in the last 50 minutes. Are there other areas that you want us to focus on, or other questions that you've had that's come to your mind while we've been talking about this work?
While folks start to think about their questions, Doug and Nicole, would you be willing to just take us to the eviction mitigation website and just kind of show people what's there? Because I know a lot of times links go up in the meeting chat and people think, oh, I'm going to go to that, but don't. So I would love to just highlight and see all of the wonderful content that's up there ready for people to access.
Sure, let's play around.
Thank
So
you.
Nicole had just put the link in the chat, so I'm going to click that link. And it goes to what is our website. And so this is United Way Suncoast's website. If you're interested, you can learn about what we do in all of the areas of what's going on. We have the Alice report here, as well as the individuals and entities we've invested in. But right here is our eviction mitigation work. And so coming through here, we have it broken down by information on apartment pricing trends, 211 requests, affordable housing in general, emergency rental assistance distribution, looking at rent costs, and then implications and policies. And so looking down here, what you can see is some familiar life information, right? So this is the 2-bedroom apartments, but now broken down for all of our counties. These are the 211 requests. But what's interesting is that you can go down here and you can filter, any county that you're looking at. So if you want to be looking at particular filters in DeSoto County, for example, in Hillsborough, in Manatee, in Pinellas, or in Sarasota, you can see not only are the costs and the calls that are happening, but how they differ, right? So wanting to compare Sarasota to Manatee County, you can see that there's not a lot of difference. There's a lot of similarities in terms of what's going on, which I think is fascinating, especially when you compare it to, for example, a Hillsborough or even a DeSoto County. Obviously, when we're looking at the last 365 days, disaster impacts are gonna be a big outlier here because we had a disaster. Then you can go through again each of these, and as was mentioned, here's the apartment pricing trends of what was looking on in these areas, and you again can keep or exclude any particular areas or any particular data points, so that you can be looking at again. So now I just pulled up one specific month, so even if you want to zero in on what you're looking at, you can specifically look at all of these other areas. You can also exclude them and pull up different areas. And then going here, it's talking about the wages of what we have.
Doug, a couple of questions have come in. If I could just ask you to pause for a moment. Renee asked, how is affordable housing calculated? And actually, she has a few questions here, so I'll stop there. How is affordable housing calculated?
Affordable housing, it is a federal designation of what is the cost of affordable housing. And it'd be another hour to sort of go through some of the details. But essentially, for the most part, what it looks like is affordable housing is typically aligned based on recurring costs from the federal government on, I think it is about 80% AMI work. Nicole is nodding because she's probably looked this up better than I have. So 80% AMI of a household in an area. Now, of course, those designations do have some delays associated with them. They're not updated in real time. And so based on the income, and AMI, is the average median income of a particular group. So again, you look at all incomes, you look at the median income, and then 80% of that is typically what is considered affordable housing.
Okay. And she says, if prices are already high here, then what is affordable?
Yeah. In that the question, because if we're looking at those costs and of what's going on, and I seem to have broken our tool. If we look at costs and of what's going on, we see that things are just more and more expensive every day. And so affordable housing in our community is not housing that is affordable. And that's something that we actually really try to delineate in that information. What is considered affordable housing, that 80% AMI, is typically not housing that is affordable for our community. And so when we're looking at this work, we know, and that's why we go to these cost burden analyses to understand what it costs with. And Nicole made me a hand motion to show me that she has a better answer. So I'm going to defer over to her.
Yeah, so affordable housing at 80% AMI means that they calculate what 30% of your income would be. So affordable housing for an individual living at 80% AMI is $1,500. Please, if you find housing in Sarasota County that is less than $1,500 a month, please let us know. Personally, reach out to me and I will connect you with a community partner who would love to get somebody into that unit. Because it's very, very hard. The average rent is several $100s higher. And so finding those units that are at that price is a challenge. And there was a secondary question about governments putting caps on rent increases. And in the state of Florida, it is illegal to put a cap on rent increases. So unlike other states and other areas where we've seen them put caps and say that you can only raise it by this percentage, there is no cap in the state of Florida, which is how we saw some people who were getting notices from their landlords, letting them know that their rent was going to go up $800, $1,000 a month when their lease was up. But there is potentially some legislation that we can advocate for. So in 2 of our counties, we have been able to be part of a group that's pushed forward a notice, a 60-day notice of a rent increase. So if your rent is going up, your landlord needs to give you 60 days. That at least buys you some time to find another place to live. And so while it's not a cap on rent, it does give people some time to make a plan. And that's something that we hope to advocate for in Manatee and Sarasota County in the coming year.
Thank you, Nicole and Doug. Alice asked, how does the United Way work with organizations like Turning Points?
Yep. And so I do see we have 3 minutes left, so I'm going to go lightning round on some of these questions.
Okay,
So
go for it.
we work with Turning Points as well as lots of other nonprofits in our area, Women's Resource Center, Catholic Charities, individuals at Gloucester Schoenbaum Center, Unidos Now, lots of other groups that have money and support to find housing. And to Nicole's point, it takes everyone to do this. So we work with them very closely to get supports. What we find is that the amount of money for any one of our entities tends to disappear quickly. And so we had a lot of these partners helping and supporting with emergency rental assistance dollars. Those are now gone. And so we are now turning to really anything that we can go to, including Season of Sharing, now that we're coming into the holiday seasons. The other question about what the impact nonprofits are having on their building programs, some. So it really, every building, every house is useful and is valued and should be celebrated. Please don't hear us wrong. Every house that goes up should be celebrated. But we have tens of thousands of houses that need to go up in order to build this out. And so what the impact they're having is some impact. It is helping, it is going through, but it has to be a mixed conversation of what are nonprofits doing, what are governments doing, what are businesses doing to address this. The magnitude is just so large. Specific examples of the money that Sarasota receives being used for, they're looking at that right now, actually. So their ARPA dollars are going to be spent up through 2025. So part of it is going to new development, but they're actually open right now toward ideas and suggestions on ways to build out this and to being creative. Like community-owned social housing. There's actually a conversation about community land trusts in our areas that are coming on. Community land trusts are where a community owns the land and you own the house on top of it. It's a way to mitigate land value rates that are going up and up and up and up. When the landlord just go to increase the rents, if they have the vouchers, can be a requirement for quality of costs. Not in Florida. In Florida, we are not allowed, as Nicole mentioned, to have rent stabilization. What is interesting is Orange County and Orlando actually just passed an amendment right now that is currently immediately tied up in the courts. We're going to look at Orlando and see where that's coming from. But right now in Florida, there is no way to cap pricings from landlords. And then lastly, again, super fast here. Some developers begin to build housing at a relatively affordable rent price, but at some time, the company executives begins to raise the rents, citing increased cost of supplies. The contracts are signed. Can we be certain the price will not go up accordingly? No. That's a problem. It is a very big problem. There are some languages that some governments have put in requiring a certain amount of affordable housing units that come through with the development, but even those tend to have an expiry date on them of 20, 30 years. And so even the housing that is required to be affordable itself has deadlines and timelines on it. We have, you're exactly right, hope, that there are these conversations that have come up. And you do need to put it in the contract. The government itself would need to put in the contract with these developers that this must be affordable housing scaled to the cost of affordable housing through the work, but it has to be done on the front end, and it has to be written into the contract, ideally with expiry dates of decades down the line for it to be useful. But that's for the next hour, because we are now at time.
Yes, I just wanted Doug and Nicole, I just thank you so much for the presentation, all of your work through the United Way Suncoast, how you're helping our communities and also guiding organizations like the League to take additional steps and advocate for especially our community members who are considered in that ALICE grouping. I want to just open up an invitation to everyone on the call who wants to join in the conversation specifically about Manatee to come to our social issues action team meeting that's happening this coming Monday, the 21st at 9 a.m. We're going to be talking a lot about what we've gone over in the conversation today, as well as everything that we've been researching in the last couple of years to decide what we're going to focus our time and efforts on to help address this crisis. Because I love, Doug, what you and Nicole said, we can only do this together. And so we're going to figure out what our part of that is going to look like. So I thank you all for your time and wish you all wonderful Thanksgiving. You'll get the recording and slides after our call today, and I hope to see you on a future meeting. Thanks, everybody.